Hello, I'm Yang Rui, coming to live from Beijing. The U.S. and its allies have rejected the latest peace initiative by Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. The essence of Assad's proposal aims to disarm the rebels and to stop overseas funding for opposition forces. Based on these, an expanded government could be formed later on. Russia says it will hold the largest naval exercise in the Mediterranean Sea since the breakup of the former Soviet Union in 1991. Will there be a covert proxy war in Syria? And why is China seeking to prevent a repeat of Libya in solving the current political crisis in the Middle East? Calling for national mobilization to fight the terrorists, can Bashar al-Assad's plan for expanded government really bring peace? The Russian Navy is said to be planning its largest war exercise in the Black Sea and the Mediterranean in late January. Is the timing significant? And is the worsening Syrian crisis the driving force?
Today I want to make it absolutely clear to Assad.
The U.S. wants the Syrian leader out, but it's held back from arming his opponents or enforcing a no-fly zone. Will the chemical weapons issue finally trigger military intervention?
Using these weapons, there will be consequences and you will be held accountable.
And China wants to stop Syria becoming another Libya. But how should China develop its own strategies in the Arab world as an economic giant as well as a politically responsible stakeholder? Here with me in the Beijing studio are Mr. Sergei Goncharov, a specially invited professor for the Center for Cold War History at the East China Normal University, and Mr. Ye Hailin, our current affairs commentator. Also, we shall be talking to Mr. Fraser Cameron, director of the EU-Russia Studies Center. Welcome to Dialogue, sir.
Thank you.
Do you think the latest peace proposal by President Assad will help ease the tensions in Syria?
Well, I think that analyzing the contents of the latest proposal by President Assad, we have to understand that right now he is the head of one of the warring parties in the bitter civil war that rages in his country. Because of that, in his speech, he cannot make any kind of overt concessions to his adversaries. And because of that, he has only two variants, actually, to propose on the most important issue, on the issue of the civil war. One of them, I think, was unconditional unilateral ceasefire by the government forces with some hope that the adversaries will reciprocate. The other one was the conditional ceasefire, which means that the adversaries has to stop shooting first. Because right now the balance of power in the country is very precarious, and he is not in a very strong position. He cannot make too much concessions on this side, and because of that he told that he proposed the opposition to stop shooting first, which of course they cannot accept. But I think that when rejecting his proposal outright, we must look not only at what he said, but what he didn't say, because he rejected the talks with the puppets of the regime, as he said. But it's interesting that he didn't single out any group in particular. He didn't name names. And that means, on the opposite side, that if he deems it necessary, he may have the possibility to talk with anybody. So I think that, so this is the second point. The third point is that not only words, but deeds are very important. And I should pay some attention to the fact that in the so-called exchange of prisoners, more than 2,000 of prisoners and prisoners of war and other prisoners were released by the regime. So I think that
in return, over 50 Iranians were released by the rebels.
Yes. So that also can be treated as a kind of gesture. So I think that it will be very surprising if opposition and their Western supporters will agree to this proposal outright. But on the same time, I would like to say that this proposal probably will give some more room to maneuver to vice ministers of foreign affairs of Russia, United States and other countries to negotiate something which can be at the end of the day digested both by Mr. Bashar Assad and the opposition.
But currently there is a pervasive sense of pessimism shared by many who have followed the development in Syria. What do you think of the difficulties lying ahead for President Assad to really put all warring parties together for a peaceful solution? Or do you think peaceful solution is just a mission impossible?
I don't think President Assad has a chance to bring the opposite party on the negotiating table. Actually, I even doubt there is the negotiating table or not. Question is that President Assad's speech is not for call the people to join the negotiation. It's actually he tried to enhance their own people's confidence to the regime. Actually, we can say this performance or speech is only for let his own people not lose the confidence, still fighting for this regime, because he clearly know his proposal will be rejected by the opposite party. There's no chance for the opposite to buy the story or accept the proposal at this moment.
Let me cross over to Mr. Fraser Cameron, who's standing by, perhaps in New Zealand, where he's making holiday. Sorry for interrupting your holiday, but Mr. Cameron, do you think the attitude of the U.S. would decide how the war or the civil strife in Syria will end?
No, I think it's quite clear that President Obama does not want to intervene. We saw that in Libya. There is no appetite in the United States for any further intervention in the Middle East or elsewhere. Their primary concern, I think, is security of the chemical weapons, because Syria has one of the largest chemical weapons stock in the world, and that is something the U.S. would not wish to see to fall into terrorist hands.
Do you think the Eurozone or NATO at large will organize something like the decapitation campaign that we saw in Libya 1 year ago that killed Muammar Gaddafi?
No, I don't think there's any appetite for that either. The NATO powers obviously think the regime will come to an end, but they're not going to try and assassinate Assad or intervene militarily. That's simply there's no political appetite for that anywhere in NATO countries.
What do you think of the resistance? I mean, the ability of the Assad regime to survive. Surprisingly, since Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and almost all the neighboring Arab countries are descending upon Damascus with the help of both the Europeans and Americans, except for Russians, perhaps. So what do you think of the ability of this regime to fight a losing battle?
It can go on for a long time, because the army is essentially under Alawite control, and they're the minority in Syria, and they know that a potential nasty fate will occur to them if the regime collapses. So they can best hope for making a deal when Assad goes, but there's no sign of Assad going. There's no sign of anyone preparing to oust him internally, even though there's a continual stream of really high-ranking defectors. So, unfortunately, the situation could carry on like this for a long time to come.
Despite the flow of defectors, there is a massive outflow of refugees from Syria to the neighboring country of Turkey. We'll get back to you in the second half of the program. Don't go away, Mr. Cameron. Welcome back. Hailin, what do you think of the opposition groups? Among them, there is only one that was singled out for recognition by the U.S. government, because initially the White House was not very happy about the disorganized and chaotic opposition groups.
Actually, there is not only one. There is two, but one is lose the support by the United States. Now the United States get a new one. Actually, it's quite simple. American do has the intention to top down the Bashar Assad, but the Washington has a very serious concern. Not the consequence of this regime collapse. It's what will happen after the collapse, not the price paid by this collapse.
We are still awash with a bitter memory that it's very difficult for the Libyan regime, the new Libyan regime, to collect guns and weapons from the ragtag armed groups in the wake of the civil strife, in the wake of the killing of
it's not what I'm talking about. It's
What's
not.
your point?
It's still the price of the collective weapons from the countrywide. It's only the price of the collapse. But the question, who is in charge of the rebuilding this country. That's the priority concern of the United States. It's worried about let the bear is a more Salafist and Wahhabist to control the whole region. That's what the American really concerned, because Israelis are concerned with this question.
So now we are wondering aloud, Sergei, what is happening actually in Syria? Is it more of a tribal warfare, civil strife, or proxy war?
Well, I think that, in my opinion, there are three layers of factors that are motivating the tragic events in Syria. And I think that, first of all, we have to pay attention to domestic factors that caused the civil war. In each and every, all the regimes that underwent such heavy blows and were crushed by the Arab Spring has one thing in common. The rulers of this regime cling to power for several decades without having any change. Because of that, significant opposition cannot but form there. So basic reasons are domestic. The second is this regional dimension of this conflict, because we really see that this is a kind of competition between Iran, Saudi Arabia in the region, which also have very deep-rooted historic reasons and background. And only as a background, I can quote some divergence of opinion between, let's say, Russia, China on the one hand, United States and Western Europe on the other. I would also like to say that to some extent, I do agree with the appraisal of the situation by Mr. Cameron. And I think that though some of the critics, they accuse Russia and China of siding with Bashar Assad, actually they are very comfortable with Chinese and Russian position, who didn't give them the green light to go there, because they themselves actually don't want to do it.
They have been very reluctant to get involved.
Yes, and
financially and
militarily. Anyway, they have a lot of problems at home and abroad. And
that's a very insightful analysis,
yeah.
I'm afraid.
And so, because of that, we must not take all the comments in the press at face value.
Now, Hailin, what do you think of the difficulties for the opposition groups in Syria to gather lethal weapons from the U.S. at this moment? Now, it's quite against the common sense. It's quite against the expectations of the international society.
Yeah.
That Obama, who has authorized secret and covert operations to assist with the opposition forces, failed, if not refused, to give the guerrilla warfare, guerrilla soldiers, opposition forces, for example, shooter,
the rocket, the RPG.
Propelled missiles, like the Stinger missiles.
Yeah, actually, it's quite, for the states, there's really a dilemma. The top-down Bashar Assad is desirable and acceptable on the interest of the American, but the question is that if you really provide weapons to the militants, who can ensure the militants are not the ally of the so-called Al-Qaeda? That's the problem. Now, we already noticed that in Yemen, there's some militants, actually, they came from Syria and never happened before. That means the Syrian people usually would be treated as the most secular people in the Arabic Peninsula, but now some of them are radicalized. And if you provide a skill weapon to them, and maybe in the future they will turn against you, that's the major concern of the states.
And perhaps, Sergei, the Americans are still licking their wounds after the killing of their ambassador to Libya. Some would attribute the killing of the American ambassador to Libya to the release of a video against the Muslims around the world. But because of that, Susan Rice lost the job to be the next Secretary of State in the U.S. What do you think of the current debates as to the American assistance as opposed to the consequences arising from, the rise of Muslim Brotherhood, which is against the industrialization and the secularization of the Muslims?
Well, I would like, to call our attention to the situation in not only in Libya but in Egypt also, in the aftermath of the revolutions that have taken place down there. I think that here we encounter almost symmetrical situation, where there was a huge outpour of support and support and sympathy towards the United States of America and its Western allies in the eve of toppling the regimes, both in Egypt and in Libya. When Mr. Cameron and Ms. Hillary Clinton, they have visited these countries, they were met like liberators there in the immediate aftermath of the revolution. But after some not very long time, the situation has changed, because there is the internal dynamic of this society, and all these forces that were unleashed, they are motivated by some very nationalistic and religious fundamentalist trends. And all of them will never overlook the fact that the United States are the major ally of the state of Israel in the region. So, from this respect, I think that the Americans, they have learned their lesson. And because of that, they are very cautious in treating the situation in Syria.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. You are watching Dialogue with Mr. Sergei Goncharov, especially invited professor for the Eastern Normal University, and Mr. Ye Hailin, our current affairs commentator. We'll be back. Don't go away. Calling for national mobilization to fight the terrorists, can Bashar al-Assad's plan for expanded government really bring peace? The Russian Navy is said to be planning its largest war exercise in the Black Sea and the Mediterranean in late January. Is the timing significant? And is the worsening Syrian crisis the driving force?
Today I want to make it absolutely clear to Assad.
The U.S. wants the Syrian leader out, but it's held back from arming his opponents or enforcing a no-fly zone. Will the chemical weapons issue finally trigger military intervention?
Using these weapons, there will be consequences and you will be held accountable.
中方始终认为，政治解决
And China wants to stop Syria becoming another Libya. But how should China develop its own strategies in the Arab world as an economic giant as well as a politically responsible stakeholder? Everybody raises this interesting question as to whether China will exercise its renewed regional influence in the Middle East, because it has become the most important oil business partner of Saudi Arabia, the most important oil-producing Gulf states there. But let's put China aside for a while. Everybody understands it's an open secret that Syria is the sole overseas military base for Russia, which inherited much of the assets of the former Soviet Union following its demise. So what does Syria mean for Russians? And to our knowledge, the largest naval exercise will take place in late January this year in the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. What kind of signals will the largest naval exercise deliver to the rest of the world about Syria?
You know, Syria, of course, is a very significant country for Russia, and we have long-term and friendly relations and cooperation with this country. We have a lot of thousands of students, Syrian students, studied in our country, and a lot of people were working in Syria, constructing different kind of projects. At the same time, I would like to stress that if we are talking about the scale of Russian cooperation with Syria in economical terms, in oil, in supplying the weapons, we mustn't overestimate the importance of this business factor in the relationship. I think that for Russia, and probably for China as well, the most important factor still is the matter of principle, of the structuring of the international relations in the new era. We still cling to the notion that the affairs, domestic affairs of the states has basically to be solved by the states themselves without outright militarily intervention. And I think that this is the basic fact at stake here. Of course, in present-day world, we cannot overlook the importance of humanitarian factor, but still, for Russia and China, I think this principle attitude is the cornerstone of their position towards Syria.
What do you think of the Russian military presence in the Middle East?
I think that's still to show Russia still have a very influential role in this region, but I don't think, because the military, the potential military involvement of the Russia is not the key concern of the Western world and the Syria situation. So I think that Russia can show his reputation, influence, but won't put very serious impact to the decision maker process of the Western world towards the Syria. It's only can show or maybe provide some
not
confidence.
Not at the moment, but
yeah.
What about over $600 billion worth of a military budget will be spent by President Putin during the run-up to the year 2020?
Well, you know, he has to spend this money because during the 90s, by and large, our military were neglected. And right now we have to spend a lot of money in order to keep it in order and to keep our ships floating, etc. If you have the fleet, it has to be used somewhere to demonstrate the flag. So I won't overestimate the importance of this exercise, because whenever they take place, something is happening in some corners of the world, and a lot of different interpretations begin to be linked with it.
Jitters are sent out, and aftershocks can be felt very clearly in other corners of the world. Let me cross over to Mr. Cameron for his views about the Russians flexing its muscles in the Mediterranean as well as in the volatile Middle East. Hello, Fraser.
Hi.
What's your take?
Well, I think that Russia has lost out in the last decade in the Middle East, and Syria is perhaps its only remaining friendly country. But even Prime Minister Medvedev recently said Assad's days were probably numbered. So I don't think Russia wants to put all its eggs into the Syrian basket here. It wants to keep some lines open to who might take over in the future. I think, too, that Russia has also looking to try and ensure that it's not too out of line with international opinion here. There is a dispute, as previous speakers had, about the nature of interventions with Russia and China, on the one hand taking a rather strict view and the Western powers taking another view. But this is not something that's black and white. There's a gray area here. And when you get a complete genocide, as we have seen before, whether it was in Rwanda, Srebrenica, then the international community has to intervene, preferably under a UN mandate. And, of course, this now has to be worked out between the members of the Security Council, what the circumstances would be, particularly if the chemical weapons situation was to get out of control.
Mr. Cameron, for decades, China has been hesitant to offend 22 Arab countries in the Middle East. That was carried out, this policy was carried out at the cost of our relationship with Israel. Now the situation seems to be changing quietly, since China is fast becoming the most important market for the Gulf oil exports. Does that mean China will have to be involved inevitably in the turbulent politics and geopolitics of the Middle East? What does that mean for our diplomacy? Hello, Mr. Cameron.
Who was this question addressed to? Yeah?
My question is, given China's growing importance as the biggest market for Gulf oil exports, do you think we'll have to get involved with the geopolitics of the turbulent Middle East?
I think certainly yes. I mean, China's growing economic power will inevitably mean more political responsibility in the world. I think this is well recognized in Beijing. It's a question now of the pace of this
will our Middle East diplomacy be put on loggerheads with the U.S.?
Not necessarily, because I think both countries have interest in stability. They do not want to see the Middle East become a haven for terrorists. They want to ensure security of energy supplies. Maritime security is an important element for China as much as the United States. So there is, I think, considerable overlap in terms of interest between China and the West as regards the Middle East.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cameron, for being with us. Welcome back. Mr. Why do you think China is very watchful as to whether Libya could be repeated in Syria?
I think it's actually, I always say that if you fool me once, shame on you. But if you fool me twice, shame on me. So there is a Libya case. They're no longer to be the second one. Otherwise, what's the reputation or influence or the international legitimacy of the China and Russia? Why we can't stop such kind of the tragedy happen twice? This is a question not for our energy safety. It's a question for our principle. That's very important.
Very quickly and briefly, Sergei, do you think joint blockade were exercised by Russia and Beijing to prevent the US and the Europeans from stepping in directly following the Libyan model? Does that mean we have drawn a red line in the Middle East?
Well, I think that I think that Russia and China will never allow this no-fly zone concept to be repeated in Syria.
Thank you very much for being with us. With that, we come to the end of this dialogue with Sergei Goncharov and Mr. Ye Hailin, our current affairs commentator. I'll see you next time. Bye for now. The tensions in Syria?
Well, I think that analyzing the contents of the latest proposal by President Assad, we have to understand that right now he is the head of one of the warring parties in the bitter civil war that rages in his country. Because of that, in his speech, he cannot make any kind of overt concessions to his adversaries. And because of that, he has only two variants actually to propose on the most important issue, on the issue of the civil war. One of the
January. Is the timing significant? And is the worsening Syrian crisis the driving force?
Today I want to make it absolutely clear to Assad.
The US wants the Syrian leader out, but it's held back from arming his opponents or enforcing a no-fly zone. Will the chemical weapons issue finally trigger military intervention?
Using these weapons, there will be consequences and you will be held accountable.
中方始终认为，政治解决
And China wants to stop Syria becoming another Libya. Since the breakup of the former Soviet Union in 1991. Will there be a covered proxy war in Syria? And why is China seeking to prevent a repeat of Libya in solving the current political crisis in the Middle East? Calling for national mobilization to fight the terrorists, can Bashar al-Assad's plan for expanded government really bring peace? The Russian Navy is said to be planning its largest war exercise in the Black Sea and the Mediterranean in late January. Hello, I'm Yang Rui, coming to live from Beijing. The U.S. and its allies have rejected the latest peace initiative by Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. The essence of Assad's proposal aims to disarm the rebels and to stop overseas funding for opposition forces. Based on these, an expanded government could be formed later on. Russia says it will hold the largest naval exercise in the Mediterranean Sea. But how should China develop its own strategies in the Arab world as an economic giant as well as a politically responsible stakeholder? Here with me in the Beijing studio are Mr. Sergei Goncharov, a specially invited professor for the Center for Cold War History at the East China Normal University, and Mr. Ye Hailin, our current affairs commentator. Also, we shall be talking to Mr. Fraser Cameron, director of the EU-Russia Studies Center. Welcome to Dialogue, sir.
Thank you.
Do you think the latest peace proposal by President Assad will help